The airline industry has seen significant changes over the past 30 years as to how pilots are compensated. Mergers, bankruptcies, and economic crashes have all factored into compensation being modified. In this episode, we will look into the history of pay scales for both mainline and regional pilots. As mentioned in episode 1, pilots work under the Railway Labor Act. Airline contracts predicate how a pilot will be paid. Once that contract has expired, the pilot is still paid the same as the old contract rate until a new contract is negotiated. In the 1990s, mainline pilots were paid slightly different than today's norm. ALPA, or the Airline Pilots Association, had a formula used across the board to generate a standard rate according to an aircraft. Several factors affected how a pilot was paid on certain equipment, which ultimately yielded a certain pay rate. The pay rates looked at in this video are from the higher paying major and regional airlines. Each aircraft had an equipment rate similar to today. However, contracts also had varying factors such as range pay and lift pay. All of these rates would be added together to come to a final number, which was the maximum rate a captain would be paid for that aircraft. Although ALPA set the guidelines for pay, airlines ultimately negotiated with the pilots as to what those rates actually were. Captains would then be paid a certain percentage of that number based on how long he or she has been at that company, also known as longevity. First and second officers were paid a portion of the captain's final pay. These rates were also based on longevity. It is worth noting that in the 1990s, the first 5 years for airline first and second officers were paid significantly less. This was referred to as B-scale pay rates and was phased out around the start of the new century. The history of pay rates for regional airlines looked a bit different. First, starting back in the 1990s, there were numerous pilots in the industry. It wasn't uncommon for pilots to have to pay for their own type rating. This often came to the tune of $6,000 to $10,000 or more. Pilots were expected to show up on the first day of class with a check. Second, once the pilot finished training, starting pay was low. As you can see, in the 1990s, starting pay was in the teens. Adjusting for inflation, the 1995 starting rate for first officers was $15.30, which is equivalent to $26.15 in 2021. The 2000s brought some challenges to the pilot group. The 9/11 attacks kicked off a brutal decade that would see almost all airlines declare bankruptcy. This forced airlines to restructure across the board. Pilot pay, being a huge cost, was slashed in order to survive the challenging times. This yielded up to 50% pay cuts for all pilots at the mainline level in order to stay afloat and be competitive. This forced many pilots to significantly reevaluate their finances. Pilot pensions for major airlines were also lost at this time. Let's take a step back to see how retirement was previously structured versus now. During the industrial time, pensions were a form of deferred compensation by employees. Essentially, once an employee retired, he or she would be paid a certain percentage of their income for as long as they lived. This was essentially funded by the company and current working employees. Pilots, depending on the airline, were guaranteed a pension of up to 60% of final average earnings, or FAE. For example, an airline would average out the highest 3 years of a pilot's last 10 working years. 60% of the average was calculated and resulted in the pilot's retirement pay, or pension. Several factors contributed to how a pilot pension was calculated. For example, some airlines required you to be there for 30 years, which meant you had to start at that major airline at 30, since the retirement age back then was 60. Other factors may have required you to work at least 5 total years to be vested, and others paid you a certain percentage based on longevity. During the George W. Bush administration, pensions for passenger airlines mostly went away. It was up to the union's negotiating team to work out a deal with its company to receive some form of package for its current pilots. Some pilots had their pensions frozen, some received a lump sum, and some received nothing. Across the globe and outside of the aviation industry, companies turned to 401ks as a means of funding a worker's retirement. This ultimately puts the responsibility to the employee for managing his or her retirement. most major airlines offer a form of direct contribution, whereas regardless of what a pilot may contribute to his or her 401k, the company will still contribute a certain amount. Events that contributed to major airlines declaring bankruptcy had a different effect on regional airlines. Whereas major airlines were cutting costs across the board, more flying opportunities appeared for regional airlines. This came as major airlines saw the value of smaller jets in the face of rising oil prices. Although pay cuts were experienced by regional pilots, the percentage of pay cuts taken was smaller, since the overall pay was already low to begin with. It's important to remember that regional airlines have to compete with its competitors. At the end of the day, the major airlines do what is needed to successfully run a business, and that may be looking for the cheaper provider when it comes to regional airlines. Regional airlines are then faced with a difficult decision. Keep pay and work rules elevated so that it can continue to hire qualified pilots versus keep pay low to still be competitive for major airline contracts. Starting in 2013, airlines started seeing profits. At this time, the desire to become an airline pilot was substantially low. This had all been created due to soaring flight training costs and low starting salaries at all regionals. As a result, improvements had to be made for airlines. Major airlines were the first to experience increases in pay. For the most part, rates rebounded to their pre-9/11 levels, inflation adjusted. The only rate that has lagged has been the top wide-body captain rate. Currently, the rate is roughly $30 behind where it was in the 1990s. Depending on the airline, this may represent a small portion of the pilot group that has not seen its rate rebound to its historical high. For regional airlines, pay increased to levels never seen before. Starting pay for some were in the mid-50s, while others were offering sign-on bonuses up to $20,000. Even students at flight universities were recruited by regional airlines. While these pay improvements were great for pilots across the board, it's critical to understand how the industry got here and what sacrifices were made during difficult times. In 2020, airlines across the board were faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, and along with it, a nasty hit to passenger demand. There is no doubt airlines will struggle for some time and may look at its pilot group to help burden the costs. The ultimate question pilots face is what sacrifices, if any, will have to be made by the pilot group. It's during these difficult times we are reminded we must live within our means at all times.